This week we have a special episode of Over
Very
Abstraction for two reasons. One, Kevin has COVID, which is...
Ooh, rip.
Special is
ideal,
probably the wrong term, honestly.
Different.
But we have a bunch of really exciting guests coming up, but we had some rescheduling. So this week we're doing a little bit of a different episode, which is actually going to be breaking down an article that Vitalik recently published. Breaking down is probably a generous term. It's going to be more like unpacking and talking a little bit and riffing on it. But yeah, this is an experimental kind of episode. So I'm very curious to see whether or not this is interesting to people. Yeah. Anything you want to add there, Kevin, before we dive into it?
I think it's something that you and I do in our one-on-one time where we'll just be chatting about the latest stuff that's going on in crypto. And I think it's, just kind of a neat opportunity for us to be able to have an episode where we record us just going off the cuff, talking about whatever's happening right now. And this was an article that I had read separately and was excited to have another reason to dive deeper into it. So yeah, looking forward to it.
So this article, which we'll link, is called Should Ethereum Be Okay with Enshrining More Things in the Protocol? So it's from Vitalik's blog, and it talks a lot about what should be enshrined into Ethereum and built into the protocol versus the benefits of keeping things more abstracted. And so maybe we can start off, Kevin, what does enshrinement even mean in this context?
Yeah, I always imagine I don't know, I played a lot of video games. So in Diablo 2, you can enshrine gems into your weapons and things. Or in the context of blockchains, we have the layer 1, which is the Ethereum protocol itself. This is the code that exists in a few different code bases. Each client team has their own snapshot of the code that they write that runs Ethereum. And anytime we need to make changes to that code, it needs to be made in all of those places. And so the roll-up-centric roadmap was an example of an idea for what those teams should be focused on. When we had the merge, each of the teams had to decide, okay, we think switching over to proof of stake is important enough, so we're all going to focus on that. Enshrinement means taking something that could exist maybe on top of the Ethereum protocol as just an application, or maybe up in a layer 2. And it means to put it on the protocol itself. Liquid staking is one example that he talks about in this, but right now liquid staking protocols exist on top of the layer 1 as Lido, Rocket Pool. An enshrined version of something like that would be one that is built into the protocol itself. So it's something that would require the coordination of each of the core dev teams to decide that it's worth bringing down into the actual Ethereum layer 1.
Totally. Yeah. And I think some important context that Vitalik talks a little bit about in this piece is this notion of protocol minimalism and the way that Ethereum was designed, which is essentially saying that Ethereum has heavy reliance on the state transition function. And that's basically the uniform function that exists in the protocol itself, or at least the primary function. And I use function in a more broad term, not like an explicit function within code, but everything that is sort of built on top of that is using that as its core foundation in order to build other functionality. And so as you introduce more things into the protocol and as you enshrine more things, you start to add the complexity in terms of what's possible. And I think Vitalik uses a few interesting examples in his piece about different types of things you might want to enshrine into the protocol. So the first one is account abstraction, which is an interesting one because his point in this is actually that right now, basically EOAs are enshrined into the protocol in a way, in the sense that that is really the only account type that the protocol recognizes. And I think in the early days of Ethereum, there was a goal of trying to get account abstraction enshrined into the protocol itself, right? And that was sort of a lost cause after a while once they realized this is just going to delay the launch of Ethereum by a number of, potentially years. And so it seems like now we're kind of revisiting enshrinement of account abstraction into the protocol.
Yeah, and I mean, it sounds like account abstraction is one example. I mean, even proof of stake is an example. And then he goes over a couple other things. Liquid staking is another example. These are all things that they could have decided that Ethereum needed to even get off the ground. But as someone who likes Ethereum, I'm glad they didn't wait, because I think all of this additional complexity takes months and years to do when you have all of these different client teams. So it's one of these trade-offs where shipping sort of a minimum viable product first and then adding on the bells and whistles later is usually the right approach. And so now that we're past the MVP, we're past the previously named version 2, now proof of stake Ethereum, we're past the point of having to focus purely on just how do we make this thing work. And we're at the point where we can start to decide, like, okay, where do we want to shift our focus? What is the biggest bang for our buck in terms of adding additional pieces to the protocol? What makes sense even to do that at the protocol level versus letting teams build things on the protocol? So account abstraction is a great example. If you go back to our account abstraction episode, we talked about how there's just a lot of standards that make up account abstraction as a whole, and there isn't even necessarily a standard for implementing all of those standards in a way that they all interoperate well. And so there's a lot of potential different ways that this could go down. One of those ways would be introducing sort of a like Ethereum standard account abstraction that's built into the protocol. And I think Vitalik mentions the idea that you could also view this as de-enshrining EOAs, for the idea that you introduce account abstraction, enshrine that as the new way of having an account. It's just a more flexible way of having an account than an EOA. And in the process, you are de-enshrining the sort of like one private key equals one set of accounts that are created for that user. He does a good job in this post talking about a lot of the trade-offs that come with introducing these new standards at the protocol level.
Yeah, and I kind of want to talk about other benefits here. One of them being basically he has this point around cost, which I don't totally understand. It seems like basically preloading effectively the more abstract functionality around, let's say, something like account abstraction is quite expensive, whereas having it enshrined changes that cost function by like quite a lot and basically makes it so that either users don't have to pay fees or the fees are much lower. Do you understand that, Kevin?
Yeah, I think I can try to elaborate. So he essentially did a cost breakdown of the transactions necessary to create an account abstraction wallet in today's world, and then talked about what it would be like if we were to have an enshrined version of that. So you imagine all of the opcodes necessary to create the account abstraction wallet smart contract, deploy that contract, and move the funds necessary so that someone who is just now starting out their account on Ethereum doesn't necessarily have to go preload an EOA and then send it over to this new account abstraction wallet. So there's a bit of discussion around like how that might be preloaded. But ultimately, if you think about all of the additional code that has to be run in order to deploy a traditional account abstraction contract that we might see today, you have all of this extra upfront cost that the user has to pay in order to just use Ethereum to begin with. So an enshrined version of this could be one where the protocol says, okay, we want people to be able to use Ethereum. We are going to eat the cost of creating an account abstraction wallet, or, maybe not eat entirely, but just pay for some of the upfront opcodes that, like, if you were to run this code separately would normally cost a lot of money. But now that we've enshrined account abstraction, we're saying, okay, let's just let them create their account and not charge them all of these extra fees that would normally exist. So these are the sort of trade-offs that could exist in a world where account abstraction were enshrined. And I think Vitalik also does a really good job of staying relatively unopinionated about each of the things he talks about. He talks about enshrining ZK EVMs, or even just like ZK provers, to allow for a lot of the functionality that now exists on layer 2s, the ability to run ZK proofs. That is code that exists now that has been written by like 5, 6, 7 teams. Maybe it makes sense for the Ethereum layer 1 to be able to prove a ZK proof. But he does a good job of being pretty unopinionated and just sort of like weighing the different pros and cons that could exist if each of these examples were enshrined. And I think in the process, he kicks off conversations like this where the core developer teams can all sort of think through which of these things actually make sense and what are the potential benefits, the pros and cons to considering enshrining each of these. I don't think Vitalik is necessarily saying that we should enshrine any or all of these examples that he gave.
Yeah, so we talked a little bit about the cost advantages of enshrining specific things into the protocol. Another piece that Vitalik calls out in this article is this like community-wide response to bugs, which is basically, is kind of in some ways everyone is bought in to a certain logic effectively, and because it's enshrined in the protocol, not just sort of an abstraction on top where certain people are using it. And so it creates this level of community-wide response that would be really challenging to get if it wasn't baked into the protocol itself. And so his point is basically that like the community then takes on the responsibility to hard fork these things as opposed to just allowing a bunch of people to lose ETH. An example of this to me that is different but similar is the DAO hack that happened in 2016 that caused a fork of Ethereum. The community-wide response there was so strong because so many people lost so much money, and it just kind of needed to happen that the entire community decided, well, it didn't need to, but it ended up happening that the entire community decided to fork. I think this is kind of a similar argument, which is when you have enough buy-in from a large enough group of people, you avoid outcomes that can be really, really damaging to the community more broadly, which is kind of an interesting like socialware type of argument here, as opposed to something that's much more, you know, sort of hard and fast, which is to me much more of like the fixed cost stuff that we were talking about.
Yeah, I think the idea of like the social contract changes when something like a safe account abstraction wallet is hacked. It's a single contract on Ethereum, and we see those get hacked all the time, and we don't expect there to be a hard fork to occur. Whereas if there was a world where account abstraction or like ZK EVM prover contracts or liquid staking contracts, if those were enshrined, the social contract would change such that because you've expanded this sort of impact size to the entire network, that's the sort of bug that would probably be more likely to fall under the hard fork safety net. And I think, yeah, it's kind of neat to think about. Like, this goes way back to all of the early days arguments around code is law. And there's the sort of diehards that will say like the whole point of a blockchain is just like extreme immutability. Even if there's a game breaking bug, like that's it, rip GG, we're not going to do Ethereum anymore. And then there's the sort of like less extreme mentality of seeing a blockchain, seeing Ethereum as a way to increase the amount of immutability that exists in today's applications. And I fall much more in this camp, where I don't see the goal of Ethereum as trying to just create this like extreme immutability, and if there's a bug, like we all die and lose all of our money. I think of it more as a platform for preventing arbitrary actions to be taken by some single central intermediary, something like social media where your account could just be banned because you said something that someone else didn't like. That is the version of this ecosystem that I think just makes a lot more sense to me. And if there is this sort of potentially large bug in something that is enshrined on the Ethereum layer 1, I am not at all opposed to a world where we decide that we can fix that through a hard fork and potentially make this less of a dangerous place and maybe more of an inviting place for people to build their applications, knowing that there is that safety net that exists.
Totally. Yeah. And the other interesting dynamic that he brings up here around benefits of enshrinement is this idea that basically certain features are actually stronger when they're implemented at a protocol level. And so one of the examples he uses here is in 2017 when they were talking about proof of stake designs for Ethereum. So it had not been implemented yet, but they were exploring different options. They're basically, we won't get into the details, but thinking about account abstraction. And there was a certain implementation that supported an aggregation mechanism, which could have been implemented at the protocol level, which would have made it much more efficient to handle a very large number of signatures because it was aggregating them all together in the protocol. And so I think from that perspective, this seems like more, I don't want to say edge casey, but certainly like there are very specific types of features that are just going to work better at the protocol level than they are at a level of abstraction on top, which I think is a good call out when we're thinking about these things, because there are definitely things that are just like nice to have or gas is lower, but there are certain features that do seem like they would be just much more efficient or effective or whatever it might be at a protocol level.
Yeah, and I think there's a few examples that he talks through around the difference between enshrining the more final implementation of an idea, whether it's like liquid staking or allowing for account abstraction of the like staker accounts, as opposed to enshrining more generic and abstract building blocks at the protocol level, like a new type of BLS signature that allows for different types of cryptography to exist at the protocol level, and then letting people use those more generic building blocks and create whatever they need. He went through another example later in the article of essentially precompiles. So these like contracts that will do one thing and one thing very efficiently. Usually it's like in machine code, or it'll be a contract that's not written in Solidity, that's written in assembly, and it's like a gadget that does one thing really well. And he talks about an example of some precompile contracts that in the core developers call, like a bunch of people were saying like, hey, we need these precompiles. This is like a thing that we do all the time. Let's just enshrine this particular contract at the protocol level. And then anyone that needs to do this one action, they can do it really efficiently. And then they found that once they did introduce those contracts at like a protocol level, that no one really used them. And so it was sort of a cautionary tale of when you enshrine things, you need to be very careful and make sure that it's something that will actually be used. And I think the example of precompile contracts, like that could also totally just exist as a contract that someone writes and puts on there. I guess the argument for why it might make sense as like a, you know, layer twos will also have precompile contracts that they'll need as like a starting point for setting up the connection between layer one and layer two. In these situations, you have to decide, does it make sense as a sort of like special enshrined contract, or is it okay if it's just a contract that exists that people can use? And this goes back to the conversation around the social contract of if there's a bug in there, what is the course of actions for solving it?
Yeah, I think a lot of this is interesting because it comes back to this idea that, and I kind of weirdly have this feeling in like the DAO ecosystem as well, where it's like you basically don't want to codify things that you don't have a relative amount of certainty work or are going to be used or whatever it might be. And Vitalik makes this argument around being like against enshrinement, which is essentially you give up being able to be flexible to a diverse set of needs for users. And so there's kind of this like interesting dynamic where, you know, we're so early type vibe. It's really hard to tell what people are actually going to be doing in the protocol, 10 years from now. And so the question is kind of how confident do we feel in the way that things currently have played out that like this is the way that things should be at a protocol level? Because I'd imagine de-enshrining something or de-enshrinement, quote unquote, is like actually kind of tricky because again, to this point that Vitalik makes around account abstraction, like by implementing account abstraction, you're kind of de-enshrining EOAs. And so to me, what that looks like or what that means is that for some of these things, if we begin to rely heavily on things that are enshrined into the protocol, those things not only become harder to change, but also you kind of need a better thing to replace it, I think, in a lot of ways. And so I think this opens up this more broad question, which is what does it look like to enshrine things into the protocol to a degree where things don't feel flexible and we're not able to evolve and adapt as quickly as we need to, especially because we're still so early.
We're so early. Yeah, I wrote up some high-level summary from the article, which was that enshrining features can help avoid centralization risks in other areas of the stack. Enshrining too much can overextend the trust and governance load of the protocol. Enshrining too much can overcomplicate the protocol. And enshrining can backfire in the long term as users' needs are unpredictable. And I think he has a pretty neat image in here around the full spectrum of when you enshrine more versus when you abstract more. And it'll be interesting to see how each of these conversations play out. The one that I think we'll get to hear about in a future episode a little bit more is around liquid staking, maybe not in the context of enshrinement, but we'll be having some conversations around the Lido dominance situation. And it's one of these sorts of problems that there's not a single silver bullet that will solve everything. You can't just enshrine the concept of liquid staking. It's a little bit more complicated than that. And I think different ideas have different trade-offs when you consider enshrining them. So I think it was a pretty neat article from Vitalik. He followed that up with another blog post. I don't know if he wrote it or if he just elevated it from the EF that digs specifically into liquid staking and a little bit about the idea of potential enshrinement. I know Dankrad has also put a couple of his thoughts down into a few different blog posts around this potential idea and sort of like the trade-offs with liquid staking enshrinement in particular. But I don't know, Chase, was there additional thoughts that you had on the enshrinement blog post from Vitalik?
I don't think so. I think it's continually interesting to watch, and it's always exciting to see the protocol itself evolving. It feels like the ecosystem and applications that we build on top of it are constantly changing. And so it's exciting to start to have conversations about how the protocol itself changes. I kind of think in a bull market, there's so much happening that you don't necessarily follow this stuff, even though these conversations are certainly happening. In a bear market, I feel like people are always more interested in what's going on in the actual protocol itself. And so it's always fun to revisit these topics. And yeah, I think we'll do more of these types of episodes too. This was a fun one.
Yeah, totally. Maybe next time I won't have COVID and I'll be able to think straight.
Yes.
That would be ideal.
But yeah, so we'll be back next week to having guests on the pod. We have a lot of incredible people coming up. So we'll be covering things like account abstraction and embedded wallets and liquid staking, like Kevin said. So lots of exciting things on the horizon. And yeah, hope you'll continue listening.
Thanks for hanging out.